July 26, 1945. President Harry Truman sat in the Oval Office, reading the latest communications from Tokyo. Japanese envoys had refused the terms of unconditional surrender. After years of relentless warfare in the Pacific, after battles across islands and oceans, the war was at its deadliest stage. Cities were in ruins, millions had died, and the decision that could end it all rested on one man. Truman leaned back, the weight of the world pressing heavily on him. The Japanese leadership clung to pride, the emperor's honor, and the hope of negotiating terms. Truman knew that every day of delay meant more death, more destruction, and more suffering on both sides. The United States held a new weapon, unprecedented in power, ready to be deployed. The moral and historical consequences of its use were immense. Yet the alternative, continued invasion and prolonged conflict, promised far greater loss of life. Truman reflected on the months since Roosevelt's death, when he unexpectedly became commander-in-chief. Unlike his predecessor, he had little experience in foreign diplomacy at this scale, yet the world demanded decisive action. Across the Pacific, Japanese cities were burning, islands were conquered or besieged, and American soldiers prepared for the most dangerous phase of the war. Every hour brought him closer to a decision that could change history forever. Messages from generals, scientists, and diplomats filled the White House. They reported estimates of casualties from an invasion of Japan, logistical realities of the atomic bomb, and political pressures from Britain and the Soviet Union. Truman listened to every perspective, weighing strategy against conscience, numbers against morality. He understood that he alone carried the burden of final authority. Reports from Tokyo described the envoys' refusal to yield, their careful wording to protect the emperor, their pride and fear. Their hesitation forced Truman to confront the stark reality. The war could continue for months, claiming countless more lives, or it could end in an instant, with the terrible power of the atomic bomb. He studied maps, briefings, and photographs of cities already devastated by conventional bombing. The preparations were meticulous. The Enola Gay and its crew were ready. The scientists had calibrated the weapon. American forces stood ready across the Pacific. Truman considered the human cost, the soldiers who would have died in a conventional invasion, the civilians who would suffer, and the ethical weight of unleashing something new and unprecedented. Yet inaction was not an option. In Japan, internal debates raged. Military leaders argued for continued resistance. Civilians feared invasion, starvation, and total destruction. Envoys sought to delay surrender, balancing survival against pride and loyalty to the emperor. Each refusal heightened the tension in Washington. Truman knew that the longer the stalemate continued, the more unbearable the consequences would become. On July 28th, final reports confirmed the refusal. Truman met with Secretary of War Stimson, Admiral Leahy, and General Marshall. Discussions were intense. They debated the invasion, the bomb, the likely casualties. Every scenario had been mapped, calculated, and weighed. Truman absorbed each argument with measured consideration, understanding that every choice carried consequences beyond imagination. The moral weight pressed down on him. He thought of the American soldiers, young men from all across the country, poised to invade, ready to sacrifice themselves. He thought of the Japanese civilians, trapped in cities on the brink of annihilation. He thought of the responsibility history had placed upon him. Leadership, he realized, meant confronting impossible choices and acting decisively. Finally, the decision was made. The order was given to proceed with the first deployment of the atomic bomb. Truman knew the stakes. This was not only the end of the war, but the beginning of a new era, one defined by unprecedented power and moral responsibility. Every communication with Tokyo, every strategic calculation, every ethical reflection converged in that moment. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay lifted off, carrying the bomb that would devastate Hiroshima. Hours later, reports of the destruction arrived. Truman understood the immediate tragedy, but he also knew that the action prevented far greater loss of life from a prolonged invasion. The war's end was now in reach. Japanese envoys reconvened to assess the situation. Shock, fear, and recognition of reality forced their hand. The emperor, confronted with the destruction and the impossibility of continuing, agreed to surrender. The negotiations that followed were tense, careful, and symbolic, bridging the gap between pride and survival. Truman addressed the nation. His tone was solemn, measured, and resolute. He acknowledged the weight of the decision, the courage of soldiers, and the suffering of civilians. He spoke of the end of a conflict that had defined a generation, of the hope for peace, and of the lessons of leadership in times of crisis. American soldiers began entering Japanese cities to oversee the surrender, maintain order, and assist in recovery. Truman reflected on the immense responsibility he bore, the lives saved, and the moral and historical weight of his actions. The surrender marked a turning point in history, ending the deadliest conflict the world had ever known. In the weeks that followed, Truman maintained correspondence with Churchill and Stalin, coordinating post-war planning, reflecting on lessons learned, and ensuring that Japan's transition to peace would be as orderly as possible. His decisions, made under extreme tension and moral ambiguity, would be studied for generations as a defining moment of leadership. Looking back, the refusal of the Japanese envoys forced Truman to act decisively. He weighed the human cost, the strategic necessity, and the moral responsibility. In the end, the war ended, countless lives were saved, and the world entered a new era shaped by the choices of one man confronting the unimaginable. The surrender of Japan was formalized on September 2, 1945. Soldiers returned home, nations began to rebuild, and the post-war world was forged from the decisions of that tense summer. Truman's reflection on those days remained a testament to the burden of leadership, the weight of conscience, and the difficult choices that define history. In those critical days, when Japanese envoys refused to surrender, Truman's voice, his judgment, and his resolve altered the course of the war. The moral, political, and military tension converged into a single, fateful outcome. The world had changed, and the decisions made in the Oval Office that summer of 1945 would echo across history. The legacy of Truman's decision endures. He acted under pressure, with knowledge of the consequences, with courage, and with the responsibility of a leader who must weigh lives, morality, and history itself. The story of what Truman said and how he acted when confronted with defiance remains a testament to leadership, judgment, and the difficult path of ensuring peace in the midst of global conflict. In the weeks following the surrender, Truman oversaw the transition from war to peace. Reports from the Pacific arrived daily, showing cities damaged, ports cleared, and survivors emerging from hiding. Soldiers documented the aftermath, and Japanese officials began coordinating with Allied forces to restore basic infrastructure. The scale of destruction was staggering, yet the process of recovery had begun. Truman reflected on the human toll, civilians, soldiers, and families alike, and understood that leadership extended beyond the battlefield. He maintained communication with Churchill and Stalin, discussing occupation strategies, reconstruction, and post-war governance. Each decision was carefully weighed: how to prevent chaos, how to stabilize the region, and how to ensure the transition honored both justice and humanity. Truman knew that the world would judge not only the end of the war, but how the victors handled its aftermath. The delicate balance of power, diplomacy, and morality rested heavily on him. Across the Pacific, American troops began supervising surrender procedures, disarming Japanese forces, and assisting in relief efforts. Japanese civilians, long under the fear of bombardment and military rule, cautiously re-entered daily life. Markets reopened, children returned to schools, and families tried to rebuild amidst the ruins. Truman received reports detailing these small victories of order and humanity, a reminder that the cost of the atomic bomb had indeed prevented an even greater catastrophe. Truman walked the corridors of the White House at night, reflecting on the months of intense decision-making. He thought about the atomic bomb, the refusal of the Japanese envoys, and the hundreds of thousands of soldiers poised for invasion. He considered the moral questions that would haunt him in generations to come. Yet, in that quiet contemplation, he understood that history required decisive action when confronted with impossible circumstances. He recalled the moments in the cabinet room when advisors debated options, some urging delay, others insisting on immediate action. The weight of those arguments, the responsibility to balance lives, strategy, and global impact, was immense. Truman knew that leaders must sometimes make decisions that no one else can bear, and that these decisions would echo long after the war ended. Across Japan, the emperor's decision to surrender had stabilized the nation. Military leaders, now under strict supervision, complied with Allied directives. Civilians cautiously observed the occupying forces, uncertain but relieved that total destruction had been avoided. Truman received these reports with a mixture of relief and sober reflection, knowing that the decisions he made in July and August of 1945 had prevented further mass casualties. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union began coordinating post-war aid, reconstruction, and governance. Truman understood that the war's end was not just a military achievement, but a moral responsibility. He planned for occupation policies that emphasized stability, rebuilding, and cooperation. This period, though quieter than the battles, required careful judgment, diplomacy, and foresight that in his memoirs, Truman would later describe the intense weight of leadership during those critical weeks. He wrote of sleepless nights, constant updates from the Pacific, and the daily reminders of human suffering. Yet he also emphasized the courage of the men who carried out orders, the resilience of civilians, and the importance of decisive action when the fate of nations is at stake. American soldiers, meanwhile, began documenting their experiences. Letters, photographs, and reports conveyed the complexity of the occupation, interactions with civilians, coordination with Japanese officials, and the challenge of maintaining order amidst the ruins. Truman read many of these first-hand accounts, understanding that leadership extended beyond policy and strategy. It was also about the human lives affected by every decision. In Washington, Truman met with cabinet members and military leaders to review progress. Discussions focused on rebuilding infrastructure, repatriating soldiers, and preparing for the post-war world. Every choice carried the weight of precedent: how to treat a defeated nation, how to prevent future conflict, and how to honor the sacrifices made by millions. Truman's measured approach reflected both strategic acumen and moral consideration. Meanwhile, Japan slowly adjusted to the new reality. Schools reopened, food distribution was organized under Allied supervision, and civilians cautiously returned to their daily routines. The shadow of war lingered, but hope gradually returned. Truman understood that peace was not simply the absence of fighting. It required active effort, guidance, and patience. Truman also considered the lessons for the future. The atomic bomb had ended the war swiftly, but it had introduced a new era of unprecedented power. Diplomacy, strategy, and moral judgment would now shape international relations in ways never before imagined. He knew the world would watch America's actions closely, and the responsibility of leadership had shifted from wartime command to long-term global stewardship. In the quiet moments of reflection, Truman thought of the young men who had fought and died, of civilians whose lives had been shattered, and of the fragile promise of peace. He understood that the decisions he made were inseparable from the lives of millions and the course of history itself. His resolve, judgment, and moral courage had defined the outcome of the Pacific War. The surrender of Japan, formalized on September 2, 1945, brought a definitive end to World War II. Truman's leadership, from July through the surrender, exemplified the weight of responsibility, the complexity of moral decision-making, and the necessity of decisive action. History would remember those days as a turning point, not only in the war, but in the shaping of the modern world. Across the globe, nations began to rebuild. Soldiers returned home, governments restored order, and societies faced the immense challenge of reconstruction. Truman continued to reflect on the months of intense tension, the defiance of the Japanese envoys, and the human consequences of every decision. Leadership, he knew, was measured not only by victories but by the courage to act in moments of immense pressure. That he recalled the words he had spoken privately to advisors, the moments of doubt, the sleepless nights, and the constant flow of intelligence from the Pacific. The surrender of Japan represented both the triumph of strategy and the burden of conscience. Truman's actions had ended a global conflict, saved countless lives, and set the stage for a new era of international relations. As Truman looked forward to the post-war world, he understood that the decisions of July and August 1945 would resonate for generations. The atomic bomb, the refusal of the Japanese envoys, and the moral responsibility of leadership converged to create a defining moment in human history. The weight of command, the moral imperative to act, and the hope for peace guided every choice he made. The story of what Truman said and how he acted when Japanese envoys refused to surrender remains a testament to leadership under pressure, the weight of conscience, and the difficult choices that define history. The war was over, peace was restored, and the world began the slow process of healing. A process shaped by the courage, judgment, and resolve of one man who bore the weight of a nation on his shoulders. In the end, Truman's decision did more than end the war. It preserved the lives of millions, stabilized a nation, and marked the beginning of a new chapter in global history. The actions taken in those tense summer weeks of 1945 would echo through the decades, reminding the world of the profound responsibility carried by those who lead in moments of unimaginable consequence.